Hi, everybody, and welcome to this special episode of the Combinate Podcast. I'm your host, Subdi, and we are graced and honored today by Ethan Drower, who is joining us from Mexico. Welcome, Ethan.
Hey, Subi, so glad to be on here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So Ethan's going to educate us today about literature review, a topic that I don't know a whole lot about. Um, and this area is a little bit interesting for me because working in combination products, there's a clinical element of the drug entity, but then there's also the CER that's now sort of gained a little bit of steam and has elevated in importance in some way and has increased in definition from the update in the MDR. And so you all are focused on MDR primarily, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So I guess before we jump in, Ethan and I were talking about his background, and I always laugh because if it's somebody who has a CS background or is coming from a software base, it's kind of like following a spaghetti, trying to figure out what the timeline is. So I'm not even going to try. Ethan, if you could tell folks your kind of story up until now.
Yes, absolutely. And you're definitely right about software folks taking very confusing paths at times. And I like to say that my career has been very problem driven and not directed by necessarily my specific specific goals. So when we latch on and I come across an industry that has a problem that can be solved with software, with a little bit more organization, with some algorithmic thinking, that's really when I start to dig in. So naturally, when I was younger, it was the financial industry that there's lots of problems that can be solved there. Also got into the kind of consumer app space for a bit. Did a few passion projects in the speech therapy world. That's a very interesting set of problems, especially for children that struggle with improving their speech. And then, about 4 or 5 years ago, came across the medical device industry and specifically the regulatory industry, and kind of found a home here and really enjoyed not just the problem but the people and the industry as a whole. I think this is a very special industry with a very unique set of folks trying to solve the problem, and they don't do it for the glamour, right? They do it. They have a much more shared mission and a shared appreciation for doing things the right way. And I haven't really found that in other industries as much as I have in the regulatory world. So I'm loving it.
What about outside of the people, what about the medical device space particularly? I mean, okay, so I hear what you're saying, but when people go into software engineering, right, they're not thinking I'm going to help compliance folks with this problem that they have. So, right. So what
Certainly
about,
not.
because I hear what, okay, that's a medical device industry, but particularly QA, RA, even people who study biomedical engineering don't want to get close to that part of the industry sometimes with a 10-foot pole as they're exiting school, right? They want to work in a lab
Yeah.
and stuff like that. And so anything there that attracted you?
I think the the difficulty and the perception of it being kind of a very boring and stiff world attracted me. As I kind of grew as an entrepreneur, you start to gravitate less towards the really hot ticket, the really popular thing that everybody's trying to build, self-driving cars, blockchain, etc. And you start to kind of become more intrigued by an industry that everybody's written off for some reason. So when we found that there were interesting problems, interesting data problems that can be solved, or at least addressed in this kind of industry, and it's not one that you know TechCrunch and Silicon Valley are trying to go crazy on. They're not trying to change the world of it, but at the same time, it has a massive impact on people, on humanity. It was kind of the perfect intersection of written off a little bit, but also a hugely important piece of the health space of the device world. Without RA people doing the paperwork and getting these things to market, the devices, we can't innovate, we can't actually help patients, which is the whole point.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what intrigued me. It was a big juicy market that nobody in the tech world really cares about, or sees the potential, in my opinion.
Yeah, you're probably not going to be giving the keynote at CES, right?
We're not, no, we're not getting in. Nobody's putting us on TV or anything like that, because people think it's boring, and it gets written off in budgets. RA people have, been cast into the basements for years to do their paperwork and be quiet. And I think that misconception is a huge opportunity for innovation.
Yeah, I found that because I actually personally, I found that to be the case actually with RA, and I've recently started to I don't want to say recently, over the last few years, I've gotten really interested in RA. But more recently, human factors was an area that I found to be kind of boring. I knew it was important, and I had been part of a bunch of human factor studies and had some solid experience in the area. But it wasn't until
Mhm.
I started talking to sort of leaders in the space that and reading some of the stuff that they were giving me that I started to have more of an appreciation to it. And I think it's the show me your friends, I'll show you your future. If you, regardless of whatever subject area, if you surround yourself like any subject can be boring, but if you meet somebody who is into it, then it's electric, right? They'll convince you that it's
Yes.
not before you convince them that it is boring. So that's really cool. And I also like what you said about having a problem driven career, because that's I haven't heard that before. um and I think regardless of industry, I think that's a really cool way to sort of map out your story. How did you talked about finance, you talked about consumer apps, speech therapy, and that, but I mean, did you just kind of follow your passions to find what problem you were going to focus on, or how did you pick?
Within medical device, you mean?
Generally speaking, because you said your career is problem driven, right? So
I
how
would
did you?
general. I got you. I got you. So generally, it's no. It comes down to the people. You meet somebody and you find out. I've always had a very inquisitive nature. So if I meet somebody that's in an industry I don't quite understand or have a lot of experience with, I like to just dig in just out of curiosity. And when it came to medical devices, it was easy because it was my father that tipped me onto this problem, because
Oh,
he was working for a major device manufacturer, and we went out to dinner one day and he was complaining to me about MDR, and how he gave this big presentation about how there's no way that him and his staff of 2 people were going to do 100 literature reviews and maintain them over the long run. And he put this whole thing together because it was years out. It was a year or two ahead of the actual implementation. And he was just whining to me because nobody listened to him, and
mm.
they just said, yeah, we'll get it done, you guys work quick, so it should be fine. um, and that's when it kind of piqued my interest, because I said, so every company he's going to have to do this. And he's like, yeah. And then he was asking me, because he knew I build tools in all kinds of spaces. So he showed me a report that an outline he was working on, and he said, how much of this could we kind of automate or improve with software? And I was like, oh, quite a bit. And that's kind of how I got hooked into this problem. And I did some more research, and I kind of networked in the industry. And regulatory people are great; they're happy to talk about their problems with you. So we kind of got some good validation of what we were trying to improve. And then we just kind of went for it.
Wow. So your partner is your dad?
Yeah, yeah. He's
That,
he's a co-founder. He's a big he's a major partner in the company.
that's so cool. Um,
Yeah,
wow, because I heard you talk about, your co-founder having 30 or 40 years of experience, I think you said. I hadn't
yeah.
realized that it was your father. That's so cool. Um,
Yep, yep. It's one of the few partners you can truly trust in
yeah.
business. So um, it's honestly been a dream working together and collaborating on this, and being able to leverage his insights is just it's just a huge advantage.
Yeah, it's funny, like I've heard a lot of people say avoid family business, but my father-in-law has a lot of like family business, and I was
Mhm.
telling him, I'm like, don't people say you should avoid that? And he goes, no, don't avoid it. Family business is the best business, but you have to have clear roles and responsibilities. Most people don't
Yes.
write things down, right? So that's so cool.
Yes,
I love that.
you definitely have to be clear on who's doing what and what the expectations are. And things change, so both parties have to be open to, if we come across problems and things need to change, both parties need to be open to it. So it's more the personality than it is the relationship. The relationship is only helps you.
Yeah, that's sick. Okay,
Yeah.
so now let's move on to the problem, right? Because
Yeah.
literature search is what I wanted to talk to you about.
Yes.
As you were going around talking to RA folks, my experience is that it's medical safety clinical folks that are doing the literature searches, not RA. And so maybe if you can describe what was the problem?
Well, and that is true in companies that have bigger departments where they can separate it out and they have an actual clinical evaluation team. A lot of our clients, though, regulatory, QA, clinical, is a team of one or two people.
Mm,
So a lot of people we work with, this is an extra responsibility that's kind of been added on with MDR, and their company's not going to hire extra people. So that's been the kind of the crux of it. Within the bigger companies, yes, it's a clinical evaluation team, and what they want is they want to be more organized and they want to be quicker.
mm.
But the smaller manufacturers, they just want to survive and get it done without blowing up the budget.
So what is the problem?
So the problem is with the transition to MDR, the clinical evaluation standards have shifted heavily towards literature, towards scientific literature, and they are now being how can we just they're being scrutinized at a much deeper level than they were previously under MedDev. So what you could get away with in terms of going out there and searching for relevant literature, finding some studies that used your device, and then making some claims based on what you've read. What you could do before, you could get away with a pretty unorganized approach. And now the notified bodies in Europe they are just hammering people on the conformity of their literature searches and then how they integrate that into the clinical evaluation report. So
Mm.
it's kind of like the notified bodies focus has shifted thanks to MDR, and now people are getting their nonconformities. They're getting red flags because what they did under MedDev no longer flies, and that's the crux of the problem.
So is it as simple as formatting of how it's done, or is there additional requirements that they need to adhere to?
The additional requirements stem from two major components. One is the thoroughness of the search, and
Mm,
the second is the how easily your search can be reproduced. So how good is your protocol? Um, Under MedDev, you could pretty much just kind of Google Scholar some terms about your device, throw it together in a report, and say, yeah, we did some searches, we looked at some studies, this is what we found, and now you're going to get a nonconformity from your notified body if they can't reproduce your exact results with the protocol that you've provided them. So you have to be specific about which terms, which databases, how you've evaluated each abstract. When you've reviewed the full text, how are you going to extract the relevant data out there that supports your indications? Um, and everything has to be validated. That is the most common keyword that we get when we see notified body feedback. People say, "Well, how can you be sure that your results are validated?" And manufacturers that were just kind of doing some ad hoc searches, threw them together, stuffed it in the CER, and forgot about it. They are realizing now that it's actually a much more thorough process. And it just takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to organize that in a way that somebody can review and say, okay, I understand your process. This all makes sense. I can reproduce it. You clearly search the whole globe, and I can be sure that your results are not going to miss anything major about your device.
So the replication part of the process is super important then.
Yes, it's incredibly important. If you submit without a protocol that they can follow step by step. If they can't do that, it's going to come back to you. They're going to send it back and say, we couldn't reproduce your results.
And so, okay, interesting. I guess, what does the validation process look like? Because I'll just leave the question at that.
This is where it gets very interesting, because you're dealing with public databases, right? And public databases are always changing their journals that are available, et cetera. So if I punch in some search terms today and you punch them in 3 to 4 months from, it might not be exactly perfect. So the process that I show you that says, this is how we searched it, here's the results that we received on this day, and this is how we process them, that's what matters in terms of validation. So that can be submitting the actual raw files of the search results with timestamps. And with some databases, we actually even submit screen captures to prove that at this point in time, this was the result counts. If that has changed in 6 months' time because the database has changed or data has been recorrected, okay, but we want to be very clear that we can prove the results we're showing you were what we saw the day we ran those searches, and that's been essential.
So one of the important bits of literature search is continuously evaluating your risk benefit profile, right? What about that?
So that's right. That's kind of where the CER, updating the CER comes into play. And it's not just about going out there and collecting the data and then sayonara, right? The literature search itself, yes, you have to collect the data. It needs to be extracted. It needs to be read and understood. Then you have to decide, how does this data affect what I'm trying to say for my safety and performance indications? That needs to be a continuous process. So year after year, or every 2 years, depending on your classification of device, you need to be performing these searches, understanding them, and making a decision as a manufacturer, has what we found changed what we are claiming? Are there any new risks that have come up that we need to now address? And that process needs to be kind of reciprocal. You need to continuously be doing it, or at least showing you are.
So then I guess what I'm trying to understand is literature search is a part of the CER. It's not the entire CER, right?
Correct.
Where does things like incident reporting, adverse events, and those things feed in?
So the adverse events, we roll it into our literature searches because we want to package it and do a complete thing. But that's just of the CER. So you need to also be not just searching clinical literature databases like Embase or PubMed, but you need to be looking in specific countries, public adverse event databases like FDA's MAUDE, right? Mm-hmm. You need to be searching those and reviewing the actual adverse events and recalls that have been submitted. And you need to show that data. That data needs to be reflected in your CER, but it also you need to show a process for continuously doing that. So every year, every 2 years, depending, you need to file reports that are updates saying, we understand our clinical literature, we understand our adverse events and vigilance reports, and hopefully everything's okay. Nothing has to change with our risk benefit. Nothing has to change with our claims, etc. But that process includes them both. So that's a really good question.
Where does UdaMed fall in?
Well, when it's working, it will be a place that manufacturers kind of submit all of these, are able to submit their reports. So it's supposed to be a centralized database of these adverse events, all of these things. Currently, that is not happening. Currently, you are still responsible for doing them on your own and working with your specific notified body and how they want to receive those updates and those reports. But the idea behind it is great. We're skeptical that the implementation is going to be as smooth as it's been promised.
Okay.
So right now we don't do anything with it for our clients.
Oh, So then the problem, if I can summarize it from what I'm understanding, is a literature search, and your pool of data is constantly changing with new studies and new results coming out, and that there's increased scrutiny around this activity that companies have had to do historically, and an effort to ensure that you can replicate the results in kind of an ever-changing landscape has become much more important. And so, how does software solve that?
Correct. So yeah, you've pretty much hit the problem. The problem is you need to do a better literature search, and that takes a significant amount more of man hours, which proves a big problem, poses a big problem with staffing, with budgets, etc. So what we have tried to do is we've tried to build tools that help ourselves and anyone that is conducting these reviews. The majority of the time that it takes for these reviews comes from the organization and the formatting of the data. So there's a big opportunity to not just try and throw everything in Excel and sort it yourself and copy and paste, et cetera, et cetera. There's a big opportunity to use tools that are going to organize your literature, help you quickly review them, quickly run through them, and perform your assessments. And then at the end, generate an output that's actually usable instead of one that you're going to have to now export, try and put from Excel, put it into Word, try and refit all the tables, et cetera, et cetera. You know how easy it is to make these copy paste type of mistakes. And especially if you're going to be talking about working with potentially thousands of articles. So the formatting and the organization, and then over time you have to continue to maintain these things. So it would be nice to be able to see what you've searched previously, what your previous results were, and how you assess them. So it becomes, over time, you want to start accumulating some trending data. You want to accumulate some historical data about your literature, and it would be nice to store that in a place that's actually accessible, not just hundreds of PDFs on a share file somewhere.
Okay, so I understand what you're saying. You're saying that in order for you to be able to do the new activities effectively, part of it is sort of having a validated output that allows you to organize the results in a way that you can just pull them, input them into a CER type document. But the artifact is there if you ever need to go back. And then it sounds like there's a querying activity that's also running in the background to see what all is changing. Is that right?
Correct, right? Because once you've done your first literature search and review, you've submitted your CER, everything's great. Now at some point, you're going to need to update it. And how can you effectively do that without starting over?
Okay.
How can you pick up where you left off, right?
Yeah, so that makes sense. So you're in other words, the initial CER is always going to be heavy lifting, but essentially a big part of the problem that you've potentially solved is having to essentially redo an initial report every single year.
Correct. How do you incorporate changes to the protocol? What happens when you want to change keywords, et cetera? How are you going to track that over versions? And yeah, I mean, it still takes time to search, pull the data, organize it, remove the duplicates, keep track of all of the counts. For each database and each search term, you want to record the results, and you got to put all of that in a table that's easily read and understood by your notified body auditor. And you're going to need to do this each time you run these searches. So it's just, mistakes can be made if you're going to do it by hand each time. And if you've got a big portfolio of devices, that's a lot of spreadsheets moving around between departments, et cetera. So that's kind of where we found the biggest value add for our tools is in the organization and the time optimization aspect.
In terms of the actual review, though, like what all goes into reviewing output?
You mean, you're referring to the process of the literature review?
Exactly. Like so everything that you described is around sort of controlling the inputs into the review. there's an analysis that has to be done on the content of the review.
Correct.
Yeah. And
So,
so what about that?
so that's also a decent chunk of time, because you're potentially gathering, 1,500, a few thousand abstracts, and they have to be read through and they have to be classified. They have to be included or excluded, and for those that are relevant, you have to do a much deeper analysis on them. And how are you going to keep track of a specific article and its relevant assessments throughout this process? And that's a big part of what we do. Is we have an interface that makes it easy to flip through, remove the abstracts that are not even close or are completely irrelevant, and then we also make it easy to, once you've found articles that you like, to drill down into them, perform your extractions, your more detailed assessments of the actual study itself, and then store all of that data so it can easily be shipped out later. So
But
yeah.
that process of looking looking at whether or not it should be included or it should be excluded, it's largely based on the abstract.
The initial, in a systematic literature review, yes, your initial pass will be based on the abstract. So what you're trying to do is you're just trying to remove all of the things, all of the studies that have nothing to do with your product. So you're just trying to remove you're trying to remove the junk through your first pass. Everything that's clearly, it's a non-human trial, it's totally unrelated. That's the intention there. Everything that's left after you've removed, all of the articles that are way off, you should have whittled it down to, sub 100, ideally sub 50 for most devices. Articles that should be good, have the possibility of being, legitimate studies that are going to support your claims. So, and that's when the second pass, we call it, in the review process, that's when you actually dive in, go read the full PDF, the full text of the article, and then you start to make your assessments. So some of those get excluded in that process, but you're starting with a much more narrow pool because you've trimmed the fat, so to speak.
Okay, but historically they would have had to have gone through every article in the first pass manually.
Yes, I mean, depending on how you export it, most people just stuff them all into Excel, and then they try and wrangle the data to remove the duplicate articles, and you want to count how many of those duplicates you remove. So that's a bit of a an issue. And then what most people do is they just go to, add a column and start putting their feedback in each subsequent column for each article. And that's how they do it. Updates, it's the same way.
So essentially the manual review process combines the first pass and second pass all in one. If you weren't doing some sort of software, then you would have to look at the article. Is this relevant? Okay, what is it saying? All at the same time because you have it open. But if you're you called it systematic literature review. If you're following that process, then you're dwindling down to a certain amount, which is, I think the number that you said is somewhere between 50 to 100, much more manageable. And then, there is a filtering process where you're saying, is it relevant? But likely it will be.
It's more likely, yes.
More likely that it will be. And in that second pass, that's when you do your evaluation. What are you looking for? Because you said it, does it support the claims in that? But when you're opening up the reports, what are you looking for primarily?
So when our writers read through abstracts, it's in the first pass, they're mostly looking for things that meet the exclusion criteria. So they're not necessarily looking for the gems. They're looking to find reasons why this study would be no good. For example, an animal study or something like that. Beyond that, they're trying to find, and this always depends on the device, they're trying to find studies that ideally have focused on the performance of the target device. And if not, they're looking for studies where they could potentially support the state of the art claim, which is which is kind of a new thing under MDR. So um, they're essentially they know what they know what the indications are. They know what they want to say, and they're trying to comb through the haystack to find good quality studies that have data that's usable. Because there's a lot of on these bigger databases. There's a lot of junk that comes through that are not as scientific as they should be, and you can't use anything that comes through. It needs to be defensible as a properly run study with data that you could trust.
Understood. And then, I mean, so going back to the validation bit, how do you address that? Now, I mean, I understand what you're saying. The first pass, removes things that are irrelevant. The second pass, you can now look in detail, and through the software, you can maintain what the outputs are of the review of the study, right? So you have it all in one place.
Correct.
Okay. So, but how do you validate? How do you replicate that? And is there a sort of check the checker activity where somebody's also looking to see if they get to the same conclusion of the review of the study? Does that make sense?
So it's less about the classifications. They're always going to be based on a human's decision, right? On the writer's
Right.
decisions. So the notified bodies generally don't argue specific classifications. They more so take a broader approach, saying, do we trust this person's credentials who's performed the review? And then
Competence.
number two, can we reproduce them? So
Understood.
it's rarely nitpicked a specific study, and they say, oh, we disagree. You shouldn't have included this one. We don't really see a lot of that.
I guess before you go further, you said the word classifications. What does it mean in this context?
Classification would be, whether an article is included or excluded for the most part. Yeah, we kind of just say any opinion that's being put on, any opinion in the process that's being made by the writer, we kind of just refer to it as a classification generally. Right.
Understood.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned that because in medical devices, particularly if you look at the 820 or 13485, there's the issue of training as well as competence, right? So that's what you're talking about. Is they question, if you don't have a system and you don't have credentialed people doing the activity, that's where it becomes problematic. But they don't question the judgment by a credentialed person who's following a systematic approach, right? That's what you're saying?
Correct. Yes. Okay. It's been very rare in our cases.
What are the credentials for a medical writer?
So generally, a person that's conducting CER or literature review activities, they need to be able to show a good amount of, the notified bodies will call it clinical experience. However, we found a pretty broad stroke of, we found a broad variety of qualifications. So that can be anything from medical doctors to regulatory affairs people that have been writing CERs for decades. So that's one of the questions that's most commonly asked is, do your writers pass the exam, pass the qualifications? Because it's not explicitly clear. For anybody that's not a medical doctor, it's not explicitly clear who is considered qualified.
There's no kind of certification expectations?
No, there's nothing that's specific to MDR, to clinical evaluation. Maybe there will be, and then I'm not aware of that they're working on, but as it sits right now, you submit a CV along with your reports of who's performed the writing. And if the notified body has a problem with their qualifications, you have to send it for review through someone else that they'd approve.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So it's
a bit of a gray area.
Yeah. So it's a situation where you have experience and understand what's right, but there is no wrong per se.
Correct.
Outlined in regulation.
If you can defend your CV and prove your competence through your experience, that's we found the notified bodies to be pretty fair when it comes to that. But for example, if you're just an engineering background person and you've helped build this device, it's not going to work. You're going to need a medical or regulatory background, and it's going to have to be fairly extensive to the tune of over 5 years.
Very cool. That's so interesting. Where do you see this going in the future, I guess, as you build it out?
I would hope that, right now our tool primarily serves our company because we service a lot of clients, and then it serves a good amount of individuals that recognize the need to kind of optimize and keep their data organized. What we would like is we'd like to build a platform that is far more robust and supports entire departments within larger medical manufacturers. There's a lot of shuffling that occurs within big companies between departments because they're a lot more decentralized, and we see the biggest opportunity there for helping them perform these and keep everything up to date on a 500 device portfolio.
Awesome. I guess as we close, what is something you're excited about?
Well, I'm definitely excited to fireworks. Sorry. I'm definitely excited to see this industry continue to increase its sophistication and continue to increase its trust and reliance on technology. There's been a lot of hesitance when it comes to different tools, and everybody's trying to build an artificial intelligence type of thing. And there's a lot of pushback when it comes to using technology to help make these regulatory and safety decisions. I think that over the next 10 years, it's going to change because hopefully there are companies that produce tools that can actually be validated and can be accepted across the board. So I do think it's going to be a bit of a race to who's going to build the things that are most accepted and uniformly trusted, and that I think is a very exciting challenge that we've got ahead of us.
Yeah, I think the software validation piece is super interesting and is of utmost importance. I mean, validation is a sort of a cornerstone concept in the medical device industry. So whenever excuse me, whenever you're working on a tool like that, once it's vetted out and out the gate, then
Yes.
So
show your work.
Yeah, exactly. Show your work. Last question I have for you is, what is a book that changed your life or one that you recommend?
Oh, okay. Let me think here. I would say from the entrepreneurial side, and I hate saying this book on podcast because it has the most shallow, terrible title. It's a book called How to Get Rich by Felix Dennis. And the reason he wrote it, he put that title as kind of an ironic, jab at the industry of trying to make money and build companies. And he spends the whole book expressing his philosophy towards why business and money are not the true pursuits that are going to fulfill you. So it's kind of a funny, silly title to read, but when you read his prose, you actually start to understand what he's trying to say. And for me, that helped. It helped clarify exactly why we were in business and what our focuses should be. And like I said, we want to be problem focused. We don't want to be money focused. We don't want to be fame focused. Those things can come when you build the most useful things, most useful tools that help the most people. So that shift in that mental shift for me that happened years ago, I think was a very pivotal, moment for my entrepreneurial career specifically.
Yeah, it's no different than like I think it's called the happiness paradox, right? The less you try to be happy, the happier you are, type thing.
Exactly.
Well, that's really cool. Any final thoughts?
No, I think this was a good one.
Awesome.
I loved it. Thanks so much
Well,
for having me.
I'm glad. No, the honor is mine. How can people reach you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm very active there, and we post a lot of the team's articles. Um, and you can also find us at our website, which is just citemedical.com.
Well, thank you, Ethan, for coming on to the show. It's been an honor.
Thanks so much for having me.